So, Donald Trump just kicked Canada out of the trade agreement, out of diplomatic relations, out of joint defense, out of intelligence sharing, in a single executive order, signed without consulting his own Pentagon, his own intelligence agencies, or his own State Department. The President of the United States severed the deepest bilateral relationship on Earth. NATO is in emergency session tonight. The World Trade Organization is in crisis. Global markets are in free fall. And 3 former CIA directors, men who have collectively served under 6 presidents, just issued a joint statement calling this the greatest self-inflicted wound to American national security since the country's founding. And Warren Buffett, who has navigated every crisis in American economic history for 7 decades, called it the moment the rules-based international order died. And then he explained in language that left Wall Street completely silent why what comes next could be worse than anything the world has seen since 19... When you understand what Trump actually signed, which institutions are already fracturing, what Russia and China are doing right now in response, and what Buffett meant when he invoked the era before the rules existed, you'll understand why this isn't a trade dispute and it isn't a diplomatic crisis. This is the load-bearing wall of the international system being ripped out, and the ceiling is cracking everywhere. Subscribe now because this story is changing by the hour. Here's what Trump did. The executive order was signed at the White House on a Tuesday afternoon. The Secretary of Defense found out about it the same way you did, from the news. The Director of National Intelligence was not consulted. The Secretary of State was informed after the signature was already dry. Senior officials across the national security establishment learned that the most consequential foreign policy decision in a generation had been made without a single briefing, a single interagency review, or a single consultation with the people whose job it is to assess the consequences of exactly this kind of action. The order suspended the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement immediately. All Canadian goods are now subject to blanket 50% tariffs. American companies with cross-border supply chains, and there are thousands of them, were given 0 transition time. No warning, no phase-in period, no consultation. The largest trade agreement in the Western Hemisphere, an agreement that took years to negotiate and governs $900 billion in annual trade and millions of American jobs, was gone with one signature. But Trump didn't stop at trade. The Canadian ambassador was given 48 hours to leave Washington. The United States ambassador to Canada was recalled for what the White House called consultations. All bilateral working groups, joint committees, and diplomatic channels were shut down simultaneously. For the first time since the War of 1812, there is no functioning diplomatic relationship between the United States and Canada. Let that sink in. 212 years of continuous diplomatic relations. 2 world wars fought side by side. Korea, Afghanistan. Decades of shared sacrifice. All of it suspended because one man decided, without consulting anyone, that it should be. Then came the defense and intelligence actions, and this is where it goes from reckless to genuinely terrifying. NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, the joint U.S.-Canadian system that has monitored every aircraft and missile approaching the continent for 67 continuous years, was placed under what the order calls a comprehensive national security review. What that means in practice is that joint operations continue on inertia, but there are no new orders, no updated protocols, no joint planning sessions, and no shared strategic assessments. The system that detects nuclear missiles aimed at American cities now has a question mark hanging over it because the president put one there. Five Eyes intelligence sharing with Canada was restricted. Classification levels were changed on multiple intelligence streams, effectively cutting Canadian agencies out of real-time threat data they've received continuously for decades. Joint military exercises were canceled indefinitely. Canadian military personnel serving at American installations were placed under review status, which is bureaucratic language for, "we don't trust you anymore." And as if the trade, diplomatic, defense, and intelligence severances weren't enough, Trump publicly stated that Canada no longer deserves a seat at the G7. He proposed hosting the next summit without Canada in a G6 format. It wasn't enough to expel them from every framework of cooperation. He wanted to erase them from the table entirely. Now, what happened next is the part of this story that matters most. Because the U.S.-Canada severance, as catastrophic as it is on its own terms, was not the story, it was the catalyst. The story is what broke everywhere else. Think of a building. Every building has load-bearing walls. These aren't the decorative walls that divide rooms. They're the walls that hold up the structure. You can knock out a decorative wall and nothing happens. But if you remove a load-bearing wall, the ceiling doesn't just sag in that room. Cracks appear in every room, floors shift, doors stop closing. And if the foundation was already under stress, the whole building can come down. The US-Canada relationship was a load-bearing wall of the global order. Not because it was the most dramatic relationship in the world, but because it was the most stable. It was the proof of concept. It was the thing that every other alliance, every other trade agreement, every other international institution pointed to and said, see, this is how it works. Two nations, deeply integrated, mutually respectful, governed by rules that both sides honor. If that relationship can be destroyed by one man's executive order in one afternoon, then nothing in the international system is safe. And the system began cracking within hours. NATO convened an emergency session in Brussels, the first unscheduled emergency session since Russia invaded Ukraine. But this time, the crisis wasn't caused by an adversary. It was caused by the leader of the alliance itself. France and Germany issued an extraordinary joint statement. If the United States can expel its most integrated ally from foundational agreements without consultation, without process, and without consequence, then no NATO commitment can be considered credible. We call on all member states to conduct an urgent reassessment of alliance reliability. Those words, alliance reliability, sent shockwaves through every European capital. Because reassess alliance reliability is diplomatic code for, we need to figure out if these promises are real. Turkey, already the most skeptical NATO member, used the moment to announce it would reassess the scope and nature of its NATO obligations, language that intelligence analysts read as Turkey preparing to formalize its drift toward Russia and its own regional agenda. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, responded with something closer to existential panic. These are countries that depend on NATO's Article 5 for their survival. They border Russia. Their national defense strategies are built entirely on the assumption that if Russia attacks, NATO responds. If the United States can kick Canada out of its alliance framework overnight by executive order, Article 5 is not a guarantee. It's a suggestion. And suggestions don't stop Russian tanks. Poland, which has been the most pro-American country in Europe for decades, hosting American military bases, buying American weapons systems, publicly defending American foreign policy at every turn, summoned its American ambassador for what it called urgent consultations. When Poland is questioning the American alliance, the foundation has cracked. The trade order cracks simultaneously. The USMCA wasn't just any trade agreement. It was the most recent, most comprehensive, and most modern trade deal the United States had signed. It was supposed to be the gold standard proof that America could still negotiate, honor, and maintain complex multilateral economic frameworks. If the gold standard can be suspended by executive order overnight, then no trade agreement with the United States is secure. Not the US-Japan deal, not the US-EU framework, not any of them. Japanese and European trade officials began what they publicly called contingency planning, reviewing what happens if their agreements are next. The WTO Director General issued an extraordinary public statement warning of cascading trade uncertainty, unprecedented in the post-war era. Every trade negotiator in the world learned the same lesson at the same time. Agreements with the United States are not contracts. They're suggestions that can be revoked without notice by whoever happens to be sitting in the Oval Office. The intelligence crisis may be the most dangerous of all, and it's the one getting the least attention. Five Eyes, the intelligence sharing alliance among the US, Canada, UK, Australia, and New Zealand, is the crown jewel of Western intelligence cooperation. It operates on a principle of absolute mutual trust. Each member covers the blind spots of the others. Canada's Signals Intelligence Service, CSE, monitors geographic regions and communications targets that complement American coverage. Cut Canada out, and you don't just lose Canadian intelligence. You lose the coverage of the threats Canada was watching for you. You create gaps, and gaps in intelligence get people killed. 3 former CIA directors issued an unprecedented joint public statement restricting intelligence sharing with Canada for political reasons represents the most dangerous act of national security self-harm we have witnessed in our collective century of service to this nation. A former MI6 chief separately warned that intelligence networks built over decades can be destroyed in days. Rebuilding them takes decades more. Some of this damage may prove irreversible, and the remaining Five Eyes members, the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, are now asking the question that poisons every intelligence relationship. Could this happen to us? Could our intelligence sharing be weaponized for political purposes by a future American president? And if the answer is maybe, then the sharing stops, because intelligence agencies that can't trust each other don't share, and agencies that don't share miss threats. Then the predators moved. They didn't hesitate. They didn't deliberate. They didn't wait to see how the situation developed, or whether cooler heads might prevail. They watched the Western alliance fracture, and they acted within hours. Because predators don't operate on hope. They operate on opportunity. and the largest strategic opportunity in a generation just opened up in front of them. Russia repositioned military units closer to the Estonian and Latvian borders within 24 hours. Not major offensive formations, not yet, but reconnaissance units, electronic warfare assets, and logistics staging elements that any military analyst would recognize as the preparation for a larger movement. Russian state media, which operates as an extension of the Kremlin's strategic messaging, began running stories questioning the historical legitimacy of Baltic state borders, a rhetorical pattern that has preceded every Russian territorial action in the post-Soviet era. Russia conducted unannounced naval exercises in the Baltic Sea, deploying vessels that had been docked at Kaliningrad into shipping lanes used by NATO member states. The Estonian Prime Minister held an emergency press conference, and her words carried the weight of a nation that has spent its entire modern existence preparing for the moment when its survival would be tested. "We are watching the alliance that guarantees our survival fracture in real time," she said. "We need answers from Washington, and we need them immediately." But Washington wasn't answering. Washington was too busy dealing with the fallout of its own actions to reassure allies an ocean away. The Estonian defense minister, speaking separately to the BBC, was more blunt. "We have always planned for the possibility that Russia would test Article 5. We never planned for the possibility that the United States would make Article 5 meaningless before Russia even had to." Latvia and Lithuania echoed the panic. Lithuania announced it was accelerating its conscription timeline. Latvia began emergency consultations with Nordic neighbors Sweden, Finland, Norway, about regional defense arrangements that could function independent of NATO. These are countries of 2 million people, 3 million people, preparing to defend themselves against a nuclear superpower because the alliance that was supposed to protect them just lost its credibility. China moved simultaneously and with even greater strategic calculation. Naval patrols expanded around disputed islands in the South China Sea, with at least 3 additional warships deployed to the area within 48 hours. Construction activity accelerated on artificial military installations. Satellite imagery showed new concrete being poured on Fiery Cross Reef and Mischief Reef, both of which serve as forward military positions in contested waters. And the Chinese Foreign Ministry issued a statement that wasn't a reaction to the crisis, it was a declaration of a new era. The era of American-dictated international rules is ending. A new multipolar order based on mutual respect and sovereign equality is emerging. China stands ready to work with all nations in building this new framework. That statement was carefully constructed. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't threatening, it was welcoming. China was positioning itself not as a rival to America, but as an alternative partner for nations that just discovered their American partnerships have an expiration date. Taiwan's defense ministry quietly raised its alert level. Japan's prime minister called an emergency cabinet session and announced the country would urgently review its defense posture in light of changing alliance dynamics, language that, in the context of Japan's constitutional constraints on its military, signals a seismic internal debate about rearmament. South Korea reopened diplomatic channels with North Korea that had been dormant for years, not because anyone in Seoul trusted Pyongyang, but because they no longer trusted the guarantees that had made those dormant channels unnecessary. Iran tested a new ballistic missile within 48 hours of the announcement. The timing was calculated for maximum symbolic impact. This wasn't a scheduled test, it was a message. North Korea launched a test missile over the Sea of Japan, the third such launch in a year, but the first since the Western alliance began visibly cracking. Saudi Arabia and the UAE began what diplomatic sources described as exploratory discussions with China about defense cooperation frameworks outside the American orbit, conversations that would have been unthinkable a year ago but that suddenly seemed not just thinkable but necessary. Israel's Security Cabinet held an emergency session that lasted 7 hours. Their entire strategic doctrine, their entire national survival framework, is built on the bedrock of American alliance reliability. The assumption that in a crisis America will stand with Israel is not just a diplomatic nicety. It is the foundation of Israeli defense planning, nuclear deterrence posture, and regional negotiating strategy. That foundation just developed a crack visible from space, and Israeli defense officials speaking anonymously to Haaretz acknowledged what no one wanted to say publicly. We are beginning contingency planning for a world in which the American security guarantee cannot be assumed. Australia fast-tracked defense cooperation agreements with the United Kingdom, India, and France. Canada, the country that had just been expelled, began immediate consultations with the EU about a comprehensive security and trade partnership that would reduce its exposure to American unilateralism permanently. And across Southeast Asia, from the Philippines to Indonesia to Vietnam, governments that had been carefully balancing between Washington and Beijing began shifting their weight. Not decisively, not irreversibly, but noticeably. The needle was moving, and it was moving away from the United States. This is what happens when the sheriff announces he's firing his deputies. Every outlaw in town makes a move, not because they're braver than they were yesterday, because the calculation changed. The risk of acting just dropped to near zero, and every nation that had been relying on the sheriff's presence to keep them safe just realized they need to find their own gun. And then Warren Buffett released a formal written statement. Not a comment at a press conference, not a casual aside at a shareholders meeting, a written statement, precisely worded, carefully constructed, released simultaneously to every major financial publication. In 70 years of public life, Buffett has never issued a formal written statement on a geopolitical event. That fact alone tells you everything about the gravity of the moment. The statement opened with a historical framework. The international order that has governed global commerce, security, and diplomacy since 1945 was never enforced by law, Buffett wrote. It was enforced by voluntary compliance. Nations followed the rules because other nations followed the rules. Agreements were honored because honoring agreements was what credible nations did. Today, the most powerful nation on earth demonstrated that it can tear up any agreement, expel any ally, and destabilize any institution, and face no structural consequence. The voluntary compliance that held the system together is over, and without voluntary compliance, the system doesn't reform, it collapses. Then he added the line that Wall Street will remember for decades. Institutions die the way Hemingway described bankruptcy. Gradually, then suddenly. We have been watching the gradual part for years. The WTO paralysis, the treaty withdrawals, the alliance erosion. Today was the suddenly. Buffett went further. He said that every asset he owns, every investment Berkshire Hathaway holds, was valued under the assumption that the rules-based international order would persist. That assumption, he wrote, is no longer valid. Berkshire Hathaway announced an accelerated review of all international holdings and government-dependent contracts. When the most successful investor in the history of American capitalism tells the world that the foundational assumption underlying his entire portfolio has been voided, that's not a financial adjustment, that's a civilizational diagnosis. And his final paragraph was the most devastating. He invoked history. The last time the international order collapsed in the early 20th century, it produced 2 world wars, a global depression, and the deaths of 100 million people. I am not predicting that outcome, but I am saying that the people who built the post-war system built it specifically to prevent that outcome, and the people who are now dismantling it either don't know the history or they don't care. Neither possibility is reassuring. Think about that for a moment. Warren Buffett, at 94 years old, calmly drawing a line between what happened today and the era that produced world wars. Not as hysteria, not as political rhetoric, as historical analysis from a man who has lived through most of the post-war period and understands better than almost anyone alive what the rules-based order was designed to prevent. Markets responded accordingly. The Dow dropped 1,200 points in a single session, the largest single-day decline since the pandemic crash of 2020. But unlike the pandemic crash, which had a visible cause and a foreseeable resolution, this crash had no floor, because the cause wasn't a virus or a financial bubble or a supply shock. The cause was the evaporation of institutional credibility. The dollar weakened against every major currency: the euro, the yen, the yuan, the pound, the Swiss franc. Gold surged to record highs, passing $2,800 an ounce, the classic indicator that investors are pricing in systemic instability, not just a bad quarter or a recession scare. Bond markets signaled a flight from U.S.-denominated assets at a pace not seen since the 2008 financial crisis. Capital was moving, not to specific opportunities or safer sectors, but away from American institutional risk entirely. The markets weren't crashing because of the U.S.-Canada trade disruption specifically. $900 billion in trade is enormous, but the market can price that kind of loss and move on. What the market couldn't price was the meta question: if the United States can destroy its most important trade agreement by executive order overnight, what is any American economic commitment actually worth? The credibility of every American commitment to every trading partner, every ally, every investor, every bondholder was being repriced simultaneously. And when everything is being repriced at once, the result isn't a correction. It's a panic inside the United States. The political reaction was equally chaotic. Congressional leaders from both parties were blindsided. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee chair, a Republican, issued a statement within hours calling the executive order a catastrophic overreach that threatens American security and prosperity, and demanding an emergency hearing. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs reportedly requested an urgent meeting with the president to discuss the NORAD implications and was told the president was not available. That detail leaked to the press within minutes, and its implications were devastating. The nation's top military officer couldn't get a meeting with the commander-in-chief to discuss the joint defense of the continent. Republican senators from border states Michigan, Montana, New York, Washington were fielding panic calls from businesses facing the sudden imposition of 50% tariffs on their supply chains. Democratic leaders called for an emergency session of Congress to override the executive order, but the constitutional authority of the president over foreign affairs made the legal path uncertain. The White House Legal Counsel's office reportedly warned the president before the signing that several elements of the order might face judicial challenge and was overruled. And on the streets of American cities with large Canadian expatriate populations, Detroit, Seattle, Buffalo, Boston, the human dimension was playing out in real time. Binational families suddenly unsure whether border crossings would remain open. Canadian workers employed at American companies wondering if their visas would be honored. American businesses that ship goods to Canada every single day staring at a 50% tariff wall that appeared overnight. A hospital administrator in Buffalo told CNN that his facility depends on Canadian-trained nurses and pharmacists crossing the border daily, and that losing them would create immediate staffing shortages affecting patient care. "This isn't abstract for us," he said. "This is people's lives." So where does this leave us? What is the actual question underneath all of the cascading failures and the military repositioning and the market panic? The rules-based international order was never a formal legal system. There was no global court with the power to enforce it, no world army to back it up, no constitution that bound nations to their promises. It was a consensus, an agreement among nations, forged in the aftermath of a war that killed 60 million people, that following certain rules produced better outcomes for everyone than the alternative. The rules were simple in principle: honor your agreements, respect sovereignty, settle disputes through institutions rather than